Zoom has officially let us know that they're recording in progress. The update, everybody, on my car is that it is still not registered in Spain. Someday, me and the Spanish bureaucracy will get along.
I think it's par for the course. I think.
Honestly, I'm kind of at the point where if I can get it under a year, I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah, I think that would be impressive. Actually,
just gathering dust without plates somewhere in the street.
That's right. Well, no. It's being driven. You know.
Yeah, you can drive it.
Everybody, that is Nolan Sharp's voice. Welcome to the Rabbit Trails podcast, Nolan Sharp. It's good to have you.
Yeah.
Nolan.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Nolan is a seasoned and wonderful staff in Croatia. He has been on staff for a goodly number of years. How many years have you been on staff with Agape, New Life, Crew? What do we call it in Croatia?
If you include stint, 21.
21 years. That's very
nice.
Pretty awesome. And notice you were reminiscing on Facebook the other day. If anybody wants to go and stalk you, 25 years ago ish, you met your wife in Croatia.
I came on a summer project, and I couldn't figure out what date it was exactly, but it's been a quarter century since I first landed in Zagreb as part of a little team that was the first summer project after the war. And we had a great summer, but the main event was I met my wife, who had just joined staff.
Well, listen, I looked through those pictures, and both of you guys haven't really aged in 25 years.
Yeah.
It's really impressive because just in the last couple of years, I don't know, maybe the move to Spain in midlife has added a few gray hairs, maybe a little bit too much wine. I don't know, but anyway,
it's also a Mediterranean diet, I think.
There you go.
True.
Yeah.
That's
Croatia's fantastic country. I have a fascination with the Balkans in general, and so I finally got to visit a few years ago on a vacation and went to Split.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. After a short technical difficulty, the gods of the internet decided that I should no longer be heard and kicked me off. And as the person who was recording this shindig, we got stopped. I'm sure Garrick was in the middle of something.
I was
incredible.
I was talking about how great a country Croatia was, and then Nolan was. I've only been there. I spent a week there, and it's an amazing place. But then Nolan was gonna tell some more about what a great country Croatia was.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's so many things about the pace of life here and that are just really enjoyable. But it's a truly beautiful country. People are very warm, and they have a very deep sense of their roots, as I'm sure is also true in Spain. And it's just there's a weight of history here, which can be extremely difficult to bear. But there's also a depth to everything that is just really breathtaking sometimes. And being also, learning Croatian, it's kind of like, well, it's a language spoken by about 4 million people, but it's also pretty much the same language as that's spoken in Serbia and in Bosnia. And so you get this experience of being able to be with people who are, and really understand people who, at this meeting point of basically the former East and West of the whole Roman world, which then led to having a Catholic and Orthodox division, and then Islam as well being present in Bosnia. It's a pretty amazing mix of things to have people that have hundreds and hundreds of centuries in their tradition that actually, hundreds of years in their traditions that actually share the same language more or less, so they can all talk to each other. It's a really, really interesting mix.
So if you're able to, because I know it's maybe a bit of a delicate theme, but okay, so that's one point I get to. I ask these really convoluted questions sometimes. But I'll get there. So, as thinking as being, you're a theologian, someone who thinks a lot about theology, and that you have a master's degree and you studied theology, right? So, yeah. So obviously you've been living in a place where you've been able to probably do a lot of thinking and practical work, in a certain context, in a very, and probably an intense context in Croatia and the Balkans, as you were kind of alluding to. So as you came right after the war, which,
yeah,
even for younger listeners that maybe don't remember as well, or didn't know about.
Yeah.
But a really brutal time in the history of the Balkans. How have you seen, how I guess the question is, how have you dealing with issues of pain, sin, obviously genocide, things that have gone on. How have you seen your own ministry or even the gospel kind of have to fit into that and work, and what's that been like?
Yeah, wow. Well, there's definitely, you're always wrestling with the whole question of the relationship between faith and national identity. So, which has become more of a hard issue, I think, for us as Americans over the last, in the time that I've lived here. And so one factor in that definitely is the unique position evangelical churches have in this part of the world, is that they're about the only religious identity a person can take on that it requires a compromise or a betrayal maybe of their own national faith tradition, but it doesn't ask them to now identify with a different one. So a large number of people who've come to Christ in this part of the world, going back quite a time, actually have been people from mixed marriages or people who are from kind of the border identities in this part of the world because of like all parts of Europe, Americans look at Europe and see Spain and they see France and stuff and think that these are very monolithic societies, or at least used to be, but they're not. There's so many different, minorities of minorities and countries or places where subregions like in Spain view themselves as very distinctly not the top level national identity. So that's led to, I think, a lot of really interesting theologizing here. And of course, a famous example of that is going to be Miroslav Volf, who is, I think, the most famous Croat outside of Croatia, especially in proportion to how little known he is inside of Croatia. I've told people that often. I'd say, like, do you know who the most intellectually influential Croat in the world right now is? And it could very well be Miroslav Volf. And people are like, I don't know who that is. Yeah. But he's a theologian who, came up in the, his father was a Pentecostal pastor not in Croatia, but he's a Croatian family in that northern part of Serbia, and then came up through the early efforts at theological education here, and then did his doctorate in Germany, I think, and then has been at Yale Divinity School for quite a while now. And he writes a lot about marginalization as a part of identity, and his famous book Exclusion Embrace, he talks about how he grew up several different ways marginalized because he was a Pentecostal, which separated him from normal Croatian identity, but he was growing up in Yugoslavia, where we weren't supposed to have any religion. And then he was growing up in northern part of Serbia, where being Croatian minority was also a way of being kind of marginalized. So that whole idea of kind of, the nations here are extremely religious by European standards, right? So, but the question of kind of how does the gospel interact with that, questions of national identity is a really, really strong one. So I'm really amazed often by the persistence and the thoughtfulness and the creativity of a lot of the Croatian pastors and leaders and theologians I've known, and facing into their situations. It's and Serbs and some pastors in Bosnia too. I mean, it's really heavy work what they're doing.
What do you mean creativity and?
Well, I think just in terms of every day and in church, when you're responding to situations and you're feeling the weight of your own culture's push towards something, and you want to be patriotic, and we've probably seen this as well, like that Christian minorities often have a strong desire to be viewed as good citizens. And that goes all the way back to the very earliest days of Christianity. The early apologists were trying to say, tell the emperor, hey, we're good citizens, we're better citizens than a lot of other people are. We just don't want to bow down and idolize the state. And so just pastors have to navigate so many different things here, Christian leaders. And it can be really hard. Like there's a real sense of, I'm sometimes amazed at how very mature Christians who've been in Christ a very long time, though the national markers of identity are so strong that it sort of never stops being an issue. Like not being able to be somebody's godparents in Croatia in the Catholic Church. If you have been, baptized and received into an evangelical church, that's a pain point that kind of never goes away, because it's a way of not being in the web of relational networks with people that are lifelong big deals, right?
Right.
And when you can't access that or be the maid of honor or best man at a wedding, religious wedding, things like that. I don't know. Is that?
Yeah. Well, as you're talking about it, it makes me go. So I've had this. Garrick and I have talked about this a lot. I've talked about it with. We've talked about it with Schatzman and different other people. Maybe even on this podcast. I think ministry often in, let's say, majority Christian places or vestiges of, bastions of evangelicalism, have a lot to learn from European leaders and pastors. We don't often sit at their feet and say, so we confuse numbers with success and godliness.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes in the kind of circles that we run in. And I wonder if some of the pastors I know, with some of the cultural shift that's gone on in America, UK, and some other places, pastors, that issue of national identification versus spiritual identification and following Jesus has become a very difficult one for people to wade into. And trying to figure that out has become, pastors are losing the people in their church because of political issues or whatever else. And I do wonder if there's something that the more Western American evangelical churches could learn from sitting at the feet of pastors of small churches in places like Croatia.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's it really is a need for there to be more of a two-way street. And I see that at times, but it's definitely tricky for just I see Croatians looking at churches in the United States that they maybe have a connection with because of sending or missions or whatever. And if it's got 3,000 people in it, like, it takes a lot of time and maturity to kind of pull back from that a little bit and say, hey, that's great. And that's really, really cool. And this church probably has tons of practical stuff they can offer us and experience in certain areas we haven't run into or whatever. But it's not an indication that, like, God loves them more. They have a whole bunch of stuff figured out that we don't. And I respect leaders. I mean, one time a guy who maybe you guys know now, but I wouldn't want to reveal him on the podcast or whatever, but was telling me how he was on in the United States doing support raising, and he was in a huge youth group at a church in the South somewhere. And the thought crossed his mind as he said the way this thing works, why people show up, why they're engaged, why they're excited to be here, is very, very similar to the crowds of hundreds of people that will show up, young people that will show up at a Catholic renewal event in his home city on the coast in Croatia. And that so much of the dynamics are really, really the same. And that was a really important realization for him because, he was able to kind of say, oh, okay, there's things that go on when you have home field advantage in your faith tradition, and the kind of things you can build and what they end up looking like. I'm a big believer in saying, like, if you got to recognize, like, if you're calling people back to the faith of their grandparents, that's a hugely different thing than calling people away from the faith of their grandparents. So, because Americans can say, like, we're so secularized, but it's like, yeah, but if like one or two of your grandparents were Baptists or something and you reconnect a person with that, it's a different thing than somebody who knows that their whole family has been Muslim for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you're asking them to now identify with Jesus instead.
Or as I experienced in Sweden, atheist for several generations. Like, we would have students tell us, wow, this sounds really great, but what would my family think if I had a faith? Like, it was just, they were scared to admit that it was, that was more in more honest moments. Most people would say, oh, I can believe what I want to, my parents don't care. But then when it came down to it, some people would go, yeah, this feels very strange because my family, we don't believe in God. And
wow.
So those, even in Sweden where individualism ranks very high.
Yeah.
Wow.
We're still, it feels, still very much the more we talk with people on this podcast, particularly working in Europe, that we're still writing the rules a little bit right now about what really is Europe. And so, you know, because you're right. There's a, you know, you can talk about pre-Christian, you can talk about post-Christian, you know, or, you know, postmodern is a word that gets thrown out all the time. And I'm not criticizing it as terms, but they don't really ever nail down exactly. They get to a point, I feel like, with trying to understand, because what you said, there's like, you're right, there's this huge difference in connecting people who maybe grew up in a church or have a church, you know, there's just different things. So even like with Sweden, what do you call that now? That you have now generations and generations of atheism with certain people. You know, what is that? You know, how do you define that, and how do you tackle that? And that's, I think, the big questions we're dealing with in Europe, which maybe leads to the big question that you're working on right now, Nolan, is within Crew, the, you know, the theology. Wait, so how? I'm sorry. I have the words in mind.
The name I came up for it was called the Network for Theology in Culture for Mission.
Culture for Mission, yeah.
And so the reason for that would be that I think I'm a big fan of the missiological impulse inside of mission that Paul did his theologizing. All this theologizing that people love to read was all done in the course of his work and trying to figure out what the heck to do with these newly birthed churches that were not exclusively Jewish and how these people are all supposed to live together. And he's writing on the run, right? And he's saying all the things that he says, not as a download of some catechism or some overall systematic document, but he's writing on the run and he's saying all these things. And so it was theology in the context of mission, for mission, and in discussion with the cultural setting in which he found himself. And so because I know that there's a way in which I think sometimes people inside of agape or whatever, there's like a small certain number of people who fall in love with theology, and then they kind of, maybe there's a role for them to teach basic theology courses to other staff or something, but it's not something it seems like we love to integrate a whole lot. We use it as a boundary setting activity to go, hey, let's talk about like what is allowed to fit in our movement or not. But I don't feel like we do a ton of like really intentional theological reflection we don't help staff figure out how to do that. I remember telling staff, and I taught Introduction to Hermeneutics, the IBS course, the short courses we often do, to staff in Sarajevo. And I remember one of the things I said to them, I said, like, all of you now, just by being here for a few years, you have like more than enough grist for the mill to do like a master's in missiology kind of, degree or something, go back to the States or whatever. And I think one girl actually did it. Like I think I saw the light go on in her head, and she went back to go to grad school in the States, and just the challenges of what, people experience. I mean, Barrett is listening to you guys' podcast now, you and the, multiple countries you've gone through in this. I mean, that's a huge, like, mountain of experiences and data and stuff to refer from when you're talking to other people and, trying to process mission and think about where we're at.
It's interesting because you were mentioning this off camera, and I think that I thought it was a great point, or off podcast, since this is not broadcast over YouTube.
No, not filming.
No one wants to see our faces, let's be honest. The fact that I was having a conversation with one of the missions director within Crew at one point, and it was the conversation of how could we get more people overseas and all these different things. And I kind of said, it's interesting that we're always consumed with this, hey, let's get more numbers over, but we never actually want to own the fact that this is the moment in history of the world's largest missions movement, the world's
yeah.
And can we just embrace that moment for a second of like, this is a big deal. Like, not let's give ourselves a pat on the back and become arrogant, but to say, holy moly, the world's never seen anything like this.
The Great Commission worked.
Right. And this is a great thing it's a gift, and it's an honor to be in the middle of this age that we're in, and this moment of global missions. And
we're about the same size as the Jesuits.
Right.
I don't know if you ever thought about that. Yeah, the Jesuits have had this, like, they're in history books all over the place for what they've done. I know that, like, that's not a comparison evangelicals like to think about, but I'm reading a book on their tradition of leadership and stuff. And I was like, man, there's a lot of similarities in scale between where they are and what they do, and like who we are. And nobody overlooks the Jesuits when they talk about,
impact,
history of nations and stuff.
Yeah. And so that's, that was the point that you were making, is that we're this we have so much experience. And what I love about Agape and so many field ministries, so it doesn't just have to be Crew Agape, it can be field ministries in general. You bring so much experience. So I was talking with a seminary prof of mine one time about, he was just enjoying the fact that I was in the class because I had 20 years of missions experience, when most of the people in the class, maybe were interning at a church. And so for me, the conversation about soteriology was much more nuanced, and the discussions that everyone else wanted to have in the class. And this isn't anything that makes me special. It's just, I just lived some life and had practical experience. And so the texture of the conversation that we're able to bring. And so your effort and your desire to kind of start this conversation of theology and adding to missions, you really feel, and I think that you're sensitive to this, but also very keen. We have a lot to offer as mission practitioners to the conversation in a way that maybe even, well-learned men in high ivory towers don't necessarily bring to the conversation because of the experience that we have.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you just a few things I think are really fascinating about Europe. Jeff Fountain, a guy who led YWAM in Europe for a long time and now runs like these things called State of Europe forums. He came and spoke for us a couple of times, and we've really, really enjoyed him. And I think he got a great ministry, and he loves to give a presentation where he basically starts off and says, "What is Europe? Why does Europe even exist? Why do we call Europe a continent? It's not a continent. It's the western end of Asia." Which is a little bit like shocking for people. But you remember all those weird definitions you learned in school about like where's the boundary of Europe? It's all extremely arbitrary. And then he shifts and he says, basically Europe is an idea. It's not so much as a geographical area, and it's defined by historical Christendom, and nobody wants to talk about that. So what you get is this whole European, in a sense, like shell game, where they'll talk about European values. They'll talk about, whether certain people fit or not. And then they do somersaults over things like why Turkey has been a European Union candidate country since like 1986 or something. And I go, I remember when we were young Christians, I remember that, like when you do the Worldwide Day of Prayer and then you get to Europe, and the prayers were always like, God, Europe is so complacent. Like, and I mean, as fired up young American evangelicals, we pray things like, God, please shake Europe out of its sort of slumber and its sort of self-sufficiency. And boy, that seems like one of the most dangerously answered prayers of the last couple of decades, right? As the European Union has, in the years I've been here, the European Union has gone from this incredibly self-confident project to extremely rocky, right? And the refugee crises, the whole question of how an increasingly large Muslim population can fit in Europe. And what happens is like the only people willing to talk about it are basically very, very right-wing. And that's not what I would like to do. But I love this quote I came across from Yaroslav Pelikan, who says basically all of European history is a struggle to try and come to terms with the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And that I think that's a way that we need as missionaries to learn more. It's almost like a tragic or a paradoxical view of what we're doing in proclaiming the gospel, is to say, we keep coming back because Europe and the West and historical Christian nations cannot find fundamentally satisfying, stable answers to things outside of the gospel, and that we took a ton of things from the gospel, but we don't get to keep them without the lordship of Christ. And that's not, I think, in any way something that's triumphalist, but I'm really, really drawn to. I love listening to Tom Holland on his podcast about history, and his book Dominion I thought was just fantastic. And there's an Indian guy named Vishal Mangalwadi whose book some people I know are translating into Croatian. He's going to come hopefully visit soon, and he also, as an Indian, speaks a lot about sort of from the East to the West and saying you don't understand where you come from, you don't understand who you are, and it's. Because of all that, I think it's really helpful and important for us to, I think we have a lot more reason to be a lot more confident about ultimately who we are than we often feel, because we just feel the difficulty, like Barrett, I think you've mentioned so many times in this podcast, of like doing evangelism in Sweden, and just there's a level in which it seems like you're asking people to join in, an alien cult or something. I know on first level how hard it is, and so it's really, really important, at least for us, that I think that we learn more and more to say like, no, this is not some bizarre Baroque kind of eclectic, weird thing. This is like absolutely fundamental to all of the dynamics that Europe is facing, because European values are just basically, taking the Christian doctrine out of a Christian anthropology, right?
Yeah. The book that you mentioned and I didn't catch his name, but the Indian guy. What are some of the things that he would say you don't understand where you come from?
Vishal Mangalwadi, and so he wrote a long book called The Book That Made Your World, and now he's written a shorter one that's a lot more accessible. He says, like, I think one of his great moments is he says that, and you go back to the United States, maybe in the West, you say, well, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Supposedly in the original drafting of that, there was a moment when they were going to say, we hold these things to be divinely revealed, but then they didn't. There was a moment of the Enlightenment, and they didn't want to count it on that, so they wanted to basically cash it out on reason. So we hold these things to be self-evident. Now, of course, immediately there's a lie to that, because slavery was legal in the United States at the time. So, but it was at least an aspirational statement. And he would say, as an Indian, those kind of statements are only self-evident to a basically Judeo-Christian culture. He said, for me as an Indian, it is self-evident that people are not created equal because of the whole legacy of the caste system and of the centuries and centuries of their system of values, basically. So, I think that's an interesting dynamic where we see, I think we see this more and more. I mean, and that's a big part of my experience being, my wife being Croatian. I mean, of course, like in so many things we agree, but there's things that are self-evident to her sort of and that aren't to me, or vice versa, because of the different ways we grew up. And there's definitely a ton of things with my Croatian friends and stuff where I realize, like, common sense does not work cross-culturally often, right?
Baird's finding out a lot.
We're not going to go into the list here, but there's a few things where I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah. So, but that's wonderful, because I mean, in a sense, it says like, no, we are so much more deeply formed by certain cultural, religious things than we're willing to reason. I don't know. I feel like in a Europe that's this weird mix of having its Christian heritage and increasingly secular, I find the approach of someone like Tom Holland, who is himself not identified as a Christian, like he's kind of on this weird liminal state between belief and non-belief, but to be absolutely fascinating, because he has this mind that will always, it's a running joke on this podcast he has with this guy, Dominic Sandbrook, The Rest is History, that Tom Holland on almost every episode is gonna say, well, and then like Sandberg says, like, oh my gosh, you're going to do your Christianity thing again, aren't you? And he goes, well, yeah. And then so, he'll tie some dynamic back to the history of Christianity in the West or whatever.
Yeah. You remember Christopher Hitchens? He was, wrote God is Not Great, and was known as the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse or whatever back in the 90s and 2000s. His brother is a strong Christian, Peter Hitchens, and Peter Hitchens would always call his brother out and say, you don't know whose shoulders you're standing on to make the pronouncements you make. Because Christopher Hitchens in many ways would stand up for social justice and right and wrong in some moral clarity that was often frustrating to Christians and people of belief, because you were kind of like, but how can you make that pronouncement he was a free speech absolutist and different things. And so his brother would always just say that. His brother would get frustrated with him and call him out publicly and say, you're standing on the shoulders of Christian thought in order to be able to say that, because what you're saying doesn't make sense without the Christian God. And
definitely,
I would have that conversation oftentimes in Sweden, because in many ways, the ideals of Sweden are held up as, ideal in many places. Even if Spaniards, it's so funny, when I mentioned that I lived in Sweden, if anyone's ever been to Sweden, a Spaniard will kind of get real squinty eyed and go, I've been to Sweden. It's very calm. Which I love. Tells me everything I need to know about the differences in culture.
It's very calm.
Calm.
Last night we were having dinner with some friends. They moved to Spain. They're from like upstate New York. He's planted a church, and our two daughters have grown up together. And the last 3 years, their daughter has been in Black Forest Academy in Germany. So last night we were hanging out and talking, just kind of because both girls are getting ready to go to college, just kind of got together as families and hung out. And so I said, well, what did you miss most about Spain when you were living in Germany? And she goes, the noise.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quiet in Germany, and there's quiet hours, and you're supposed to be quiet. Yeah. And she's like, there's always chaos and noise in Spain. I love it. And my daughter said the same thing. She's, yeah, the chaos, just that there's something always going on. There's always movement. Like that was what they like about Spain. They've grown up with it, right?
Yeah.
So so to turn that into some spiritual sense or whatever, as you learn, well, because I do think it's related. I think cultural stuff, we as mission practitioners don't put enough weight on realities like that. So a German comes in and wants to present Jesus is the God of the God of order or whatever, and quiet. Yeah. And the Spaniard is going, why do I want that God? Like, he's boring, Yeah. Whereas, Jesus is the God who carried passion and carried it to the cross, and the took chaos and made order out of it in a good sense, in a very, and because there's a commercial that Zlatan Ibrahimovic did in Sweden one time for Volvo, and
son of Croatia and Bosnia.
Yep, yeah, exactly right. Zlatan, I love Zlatan because he is so not Swedish. And not like, it's not a knock against Sweden. It's just that he just is.
He's
Zlatan.
brash.
Yeah, and he joined the LA Galaxy and took out an entire one-page ad in the LA Times that said, "You're welcome, Los Angeles." But anyway, and that's just not Swedish at all. But anyway, so he did this. He basically is. He's quoting the national anthem of Sweden, and then the tagline by Volvo is "Made by Sweden." And in Swedish, it's not in English, but in Swedish the intonation is made through what Sweden is. So Sweden and the landscape of this landscape has formed this particular car. So the car itself is a reflection of the people in the landscape of this place. And languages like that, as I'm trying to pick up Spanish, phrases like prepositions are funny in language, but like
they're so tricky.
I dream about someone, or I dream of someone in English, but in Spanish, I dream on that person. And it's like, what is that telling me about the way that we think about that action or whatever else? And you'll get some incredible cultural insights into things. I don't think we should throw those away, because there is insight into, well, how has a people been formed? Like, maybe some of the, a smaller thing, and I can't think of it off the top of my head, but like countries like Bosnia and Croatia, which have faced, basically the histories are both amazing and tragic all at the same time. Language and culture there's responses to that. And so the humor that's associated with those things, and the way the language informs us of the hurts and fears that a people has. And in large part measure, American English is different than British English, because we threw the king out, like we fought a war to be able to say, I don't want a king. Well, it's no wonder that we don't really respect Jesus as king. We kind of want just a president that we elect, and then look on the stuff we don't like about, we're going to throw that part of Jesus out. It's easy for us to do that.
I think you get a lot of that in the level to which a language uses and a culture uses direct versus indirect communication and speech. And that's some of that really, really deep stuff, right? It's like, how much you get yourself in trouble, because you can learn a language and know the words that people are saying, but you can still miss whatever. One of my best friends from college is Chinese American, and he said, and this is the exact same thing applies in Croatia. He said, growing up, I had to learn when I'd spend time with white people, I had to remember that whether they were Chinese asking or American, like white people asking? Because it's like, do you want, you go over to someone's house and say, do you want something to eat? And an American will say that as just a yes, no, up, down question. And so, but as a Chinese person, you have to decline 3 times. And this is similar in Croatia. So John said he constantly went hungry because Americans would say, are you hungry? He would say no. And they say, okay, fine, move on. And in his culture, but as a polite young Chinese person, he knew that like their offering may be out of just a sense of their own honor, that they need to do this. Maybe they really don't have enough food, so it's best to decline 3 times. And if they keep pushing on it, then they probably really mean it. So those things are
deep,
really go deep. But
then it makes me wonder, Paul, who's on the field writing these things, how much of the theology that Paul was forming, like you were saying, was on the fly, or it was as he was going? He was inspired by the Holy Spirit, but also forming these things to deal with the realities of, I'm not saying we should dismiss things because they were specific cultural, but to try to understand what was really going on and then apply that to, well, this is how this would work out.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one of my little rants. I don't know how this one will, like,
this is a safe place for rants.
Strike or whatever is, like, I don't know if I remember something I heard a lot in my earlier days on staff. I hear it less, but I still hear it, is like, cultural stuff will come up in a team, especially when you have mixed teams, or you're trying to address some stuff. And then there's a saying that's been really popular amongst evangelicals for a long time, where somebody will say, hey, you know what? I don't care about whether this is American culture or Croatian culture or Swedish or Spanish. I care about gospel culture. I care about biblical culture. Yeah. And the thing that I was glad to hear that, because it kind of pushed me down like a rabbit trail of a sense of kind of like really examining that. And it actually turns out that the best, most thought through, evangelical missiology says that that's a kind of a meaningless statement. Yeah. None of us get to access a cultural free version of the gospel. And it's not a bug, it's a feature. Like, God intentionally set these things up this way. And sometimes when I'm being really naughty, I've told people, I said, you in your grid, you would be happier as a Muslim than as a Christian, because Islam presents the idea of one reified culture that is supposed to, and a time and a place, a language and a culture that was basically becomes the ideal. So you can only appreciate the miracle of Islam if you can read Arabic. That's why Quran should never be published without accompanying text in Arabic. And the whole tension of Islam seems seemingly to be in the modern world is this struggle to say, like, well, is there a way to live Islam out without returning to Arabia, Arabic language, the mores of the 7th century and all this kind of stuff? Whereas but our faith was designed as a portable faith from the very, very beginning. And also, I don't know if this is a weird rabbit hole you can go down, like there's people on the internet who are all into this idea that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, and that, our version of Matthew is corrupted. But if you can somehow read back through the Greek into the Hebrew text, you can find out this idealized picture of Matthew, which is super scary to me theologically, but shows also a really false impulse in us. Like it should really strike us that our faith is so portable that God was not afraid to give us the words of Jesus, not in the language he spoke them in.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a mind-blowing thing that I think a lot of Christians and a lot of theologians really don't grapple with, is that so our faith is designed to perfectly reproduce itself, enculturate itself into every new setting. And so God, and I don't know the plan. Like, I don't know what a fully evangelized, gospel shot through, Christ-centered, Croatian, Spanish, Swedish culture is supposed to look like. But that's the beauty of it, is it's for every people to figure out, and it all adds part of the picture of God's larger plan. And that's a very different approach to culture than I think other world religions have. But even many Christians and many missionaries don't seem to be able to kind of, I don't know, pull that apart. How's that sound?
I think it's exactly because you see this played out. I mean, to get back to Miroslav Volf, I don't remember which book exactly, but he talks about this a lot. The diversity. I mean, that goes back to Trinitarianism, the diversity and unity, and that God is the diversity and unity. And so we keep trying to push back to the Tower of Babel, but the Tower of Babel was to scatter people I mean, the what to destroy the Tower of Babel, to scatter people and mix up and create different cultures and create diversity. And then you have, of course, in Acts, you have Pentecost, right? Oh, those people all were speaking different languages. They didn't all start speaking one language.
Exactly.
And then we get to our image of heaven one day.
Garrick, that was an amazing point. There was a whole crowd cheering for you there.
The live audience is really behind that.
There's a meeting in another room behind me.
This podcast was recorded before a live studio audience.
And then we get to heaven, and once again, we're all speaking Hebrew in heaven. It's all cultures, tribes, tongues, and peoples together, but unified in the worship of God. So there is something deeply built into how God planned all of creation and planned his gospel message that is multicultural, multilingual, that is diverse, complex, and it's I think that's definitely the where we often miss, because we try to go towards the Tower of Babel. We try to,
it's interesting because this is the parts when for the last few years that I was in Sweden, these are the parts of the message of the gospel that I started highlighting. So because it became to Swedes a hopeful message that looked to the future of a future that they desire, because Swedes didn't believe that they were sinful and they didn't believe that the past mattered. So when you come to them with, hey, aren't you miserable? They're like, no, actually, I don't live in a poor African village, because they thought only poor Africans are miserable, to besmirch an entire people group here. Sorry, Sweden. But
no, what do you think when you're 18, 19 years old?
Right. The college students I was talking with would often have this perspective. They just thought, Swedes are taught to kind of accept their position in life, and they were very honest and were like, look, I live a great life. I live in a very rich country. I have many opportunities. So they didn't want to kind of go, oh, my life sucks. But that's often our approach with the gospel is like, hey, isn't your life miserable? And then they kind of go, well, maybe, I guess. And then we say, aha, it's miserable. See, original sin. And, Jesus died for that. And they're like, but wait a second. First, I don't believe in Jesus. And second of all, actually, really, I'm not very miserable. And now I'm miserable because I'm talking to you. But so I kind of want to be done with this conversation. But we kind of in normal or in oftentimes in presentations of the gospel, we stop at that point of like, don't you want forgiveness of sins and new life with Jesus? And then we kind of have this non-descriptive idea of relationship that maybe you can have, but they're kind of like, I don't know what that means. But the message of the gospel is, hey, there is actually this world that everything around you with these European values and multicultural ideas and everything else you're striving for. And guess what? There was a guy who's been planning that all along and isn't asking you to give away who you are. And there will be a multicultural situation in which people dwell with unity, but it comes through this person of Jesus Christ. And we're looking forward to that ultimate. So I actually think in a presentation of the gospel, these days, an eschatological presentation of the gospel is really important.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
I think we need to bring back a good eschatology, and it can be a generous orthodoxy of eschatology, with it knowing, but it just needs to be, look, the basics of there's a God who's coming back and he's going to write it. So your desire for a political player who's perfect, guess what? That's answered in this person, Jesus Christ. So hold on to that what you want to see, but hold on to it in the person of Jesus Christ, and hold on to the idea that you want, whatever it may be.
Because everything else is Antichrist, actually. I mean, that's Antichrist is this like boogie term or whatever, but the way you see it used in in First John, it's really, it's anybody who took something away from the gospel, then denied Christ and wants to kind of carry on their own way with a part of that thing. Yeah. And so this is all this like spinning off into history of all these different things. I mean, the classic example, I guess, would just be communism, which is, like an attempt to go, oh, we like the kingdom, we just don't want to deal with the cross and the Lord in it. So, but we'll, and the super dangerous thing of communism is realizing you end up in you see all the flaws in Christian history, and you see the 30 Years War or whatever, and these horrible things. And so you think like, I can do better. The faith part is bad. And then you take it and you do something that's unbelievably worse without Christ.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So, okay. So this is a good transition then, Nolan. I know you've worked on different ways of sharing the gospel. I think that's one thing in Europe. We often, and probably in a lot of places, we hit the ground with the 4 spiritual laws. We start talking to people, and we realize the common sense that is so clear to us in certain parts of America is not the common sense of how people think here. Particularly, I think in some sense, you and I and Barrett now having an experience of Mediterranean Europe, which has a different set of rules. But you worked on a different presentation, not a different gospel, a different way to communicate. It's kind of like what Bear was talking about, like trying to work eschatology, work into people's hearts where they can connect with Jesus and see who Jesus really is.
Well, thanks for inviting me to talk about, and giving me a chance to talk about that, because it's something I really want to see the conversation expand. Mm-hmm. So I got into the conversation about what it means that there are honor shame cultures and how that interacts with the gospel around like 2008. Started reading some different things, and for me it was kind of like a window into understanding a lot of interactions in Croatia I just couldn't understand. Like, even as my language got good enough to like understand the words people were saying, I couldn't understand why people were emotionally reacting to things the way that they were. And I came across actually an article, I think by a woman named Leanne Demsky, or who is now, I think, a professor in Biola, who was a missionary in Spain for a long time. And there was an article called Shame in Spain. Yeah. And I read this article and just thought, like, she hit on so many things that I felt like I was running into a lot in Croatia. And I went, wow, I got to learn more about this. So anyways, I've been kind of in that kind of world for quite a while. And there was a conference in 2017 at Wheaton College around this area, and there I went and I met Chris Sneller, who is with Crew and is a head of R&D for Bridges, and he contacted me that fall and he said, hey, I've gotten a commission basically to create new evangelistic presentations that are more culturally oriented, and do you want to be part of this team? And it was one of the most exciting things I ever got to be a part of. So the first thing that came out of that was this presentation called Honor Restored, which is in the God Tools app that is designed as a gospel presentation for honor shame cultures. And to kind of just super quick try and kind of sketch that out, the presupposition is that Western cultures are, especially cultures that were heavily influenced by the Reformation, so a lot of Anglo-American cultures, can be, and to a large extent, a lot of Catholic cultures can be described as what are called guilt innocence cultures, where personal conscience matters a lot. Your sense that you have violated objective standards is where your internal turmoil comes from. The why you feel bad about yourself stuff comes from not measuring up to objective standards, but that's actually not the majority way people in the world live, and that the most normal way people live in the world is more of an honor, shame, or faith-based culture in which people are very sensitive to those around them, and they are much more likely to be experience brokenness relationally. So a great example I remember one person came up with is that, doing evangelism, oftentimes we say like, well, don't you feel bad for the wrong things you've done? And people be like, no. And there's this whole thing that what the way the first Bible translation into Chinese evidently, used a symbol for something like crime when translating sin. So it's challenging and talking with people about, aren't you a sinner? And a Chinese person was like, well, not a criminal. Would be an easy response. And a great kind of honor shame type question that somebody from Bridges mentioned. He says, well, just to ask people, have they ever done anything their parents would be ashamed if they knew about? And that puts it in a whole different category. Mm-hmm. People go, oh, is that what you're talking about? So that it's much more normal in the world for people to experience their lives through context of honor and shame. And the crazy thing that happens when you start going down this trail is you realize the Bible is written to an honor shame world. Yep. So there are actually more things in the New Testament, even in a book like Romans, that are hitting on issues like glory, honor, disgrace, Then there are sort of explicit statements about God taking, like the Colossians verse, this is a God objectively taking the penalty that was against you and nailing it to the cross. And hallelujah, thank God that's the gospel, but that this is either another facet or another window or another angle on the cross, on what God accomplished through honor and shame. And then we were able, after that, also to write another one, which is for what are called fear power cultures. That one's a little bit trickier, but for cultures particularly that had traditional religions in which the awareness of the spiritual world and of the forces and of trying to kind of deal with a very fearful world of spirits is kind of so, but I'd be, so there are these 3 tools now. They're in this app called God Tools that Agape Crew worldwide uses a lot. It's been translated to many of our languages, and I trained some of the folks from summer project teams that have been here in Coratia in them, and I tell them, like, use this in a second conversation. Use this if you're trying to talk through these things, and the whole you don't measure up to God's standard kind of conversation doesn't go anywhere, doesn't get you that far. Talk to a conversation, and talking about shame is actually like super relevant to everybody every day, all day long. Like in Croatia, still to this day, kids teachers will announce the grades in the class after a test, and this is completely normal thing for the encouragement of the kids to do better. And you can imagine this would just be like, it would be like a firestorm in the American education system, right? If teachers routinely kind of were sharing publicly the grades, but it's for the encouragement of the others, basically, right? So you have these really strong cultural, moments that are still there in these areas. And I think it's how, in a world of social media too, that's how people experience their brokenness. There's a great irony to the fact that the platform is called Facebook. It's like, the whole like Eastern idea of your face. You are constantly presenting your face to people. And if, like you guys mentioned, I posted some pictures of my first time in Croatia 25 years ago. There's a very nice feeling when a whole bunch of people like those pictures. And that's basically the experience of social honor. And if people insult you on Facebook or on a social media platform, that horrible feeling you have, that's shame. We may not want to talk about it, but that's what that is. So those are some thoughts.
Do you think through social media, I've been wondering about this because I feel like even though Sweden is, Protestant and the guilt, that dynamic is at play, I feel there's a lot of shame culture, that is at play in Europe that we don't like to recognize. Do you think that that's ever increasing now with social media? Like, it seems like even in America, a lot of the, I don't know, cultural wars that are going on are really shame-based wars. They're trying to shame people into certain behaviors or different things. And that happens on both ends of the spectrum. So I'm not thinking of political ends.
No, I think social media has resurrected a shame-based world. I mean, one of the ways you can try and talk to even, say, I don't know, a 60-year-old American about this is say, like, well, do you remember what you felt like in junior high when you were super sensitive to the thoughts of others and stuff? And like, oh yeah, I didn't like that. And it's like, well, yeah, because you passed out of it, because then you became an adult in a world that was at least, like every society is full of hypocrisy and brokenness and stuff. But at least like the top line idea was if you measure up to standards, you can be a proud person. I remember one time a guy said, yeah, this is like the American ideal. Like we are a nation of laws, not men. Of objective standards, not relational capital, basically. But what social media seems to do is it means that kind of you never leave junior high, that you are always now vulnerable to the group in a way that is, and this that's why our kids, our younger generation is seeing this as such a bigger struggle. And I think like it's really interesting. I think like for one thing, a lot of ancient Romans like Caesar would have just dominated on Twitter or whatever. I mean, these guys knew that those kind of fights to them were everyday stuff. But then I think like the Stoics would have looked at social media and said, like, are you guys crazy? Like, do you not understand the power of this platform? Like, get away from it. And, And there's a whole dynamic too, like cultural people that do cultural studies about the New Testament say a lot. Like there's this wonderful tension of the way that Jesus wins all the honor contests he gets into. Like no one ever gets the better of him.
Mm-hmm.
So he's super, super good at it. But then like the whole Sermon on the Mount is pretty much about like call it off. Don't do it. Don't live your life that way. My followers, like I can kind of like, in a sense, like Jesus can handle it. But like, we're probably supposed to find a way to live more humbly and stuff than that. So yeah, I think that's what the dynamic there is. And that, I mean, Barrett, like that, I'd love to have more conversation about that sometime, like sort of like what you saw in Sweden and stuff, because I doubt that people are as okay. I think it's actually a big cultural burden to grow up in a culture, I would assume, where you're told like, we pretty much have it the best anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And supposedly there was a really popular TV show in Norway that was, the name of the show was Shame, and it was about high schoolers, and it was pretty rough and ugly and catastrophic. And it's just, you know, in America, like, you know, TV shows like 13 Reasons Why, they're supposed to be set in like the Bay Area in California. There's supposed to be pretty much heaven on earth, right? And just everybody's in agony all the time. Yeah. So, you know, it's I think shame is shame is a really popular topic, but the way it's talking about in America is always therapeutic. And it says like, basically you should have no shame.
Right. And that's the way it gets talked about in Sweden. But the reality is everyone carries around lots of shame. Different shame though than it was 100 years ago.
Yes.
Then it was sexual shame. So
yes.
Sweden has removed sexual shame completely. But there are other shames that people are carrying around. And then I see more traditional shame at play here in Spain. Less so than maybe I did when I was living in Central Asia, but it's certainly at play to a greater degree. But everyone's carrying shame around. So I don't know. I've been aware of the honor restored tool and amazed at what you guys did, and I want to start using it around here to have those conversations to get into, see if we can get deeper, or maybe maybe long term, I'm ideating now, maybe long term there needs to be a European honor restored, kind of tweak to it for some of these. Look, shame, I don't know, it seems to me in Genesis, right? Shame is what we're dealing with. At the end of the day, that's where it comes in. And that's one of the biggest drivers of sin in the world, is the shame that we feel for things, which leads us to other sin. It leads us to our anxieties, which leads to
one of the things I want to do is I'd love to be a part of at some point, like with digital strategies or something, is actually to try and design surveys or something that would be appealing to people, that would kind of give them a personality test, almost like what percent, are you guilt, shame, or fear sort of oriented, and then say, well, this means that in your life, you're looking for these kinds of things. And then like, hey, are you, would you be interested in kind of how the Bible speaks to those specific areas? Because you have these wonderful verses and, passages that really directly go at a lot of those experiences. And I think there is a way in which, one of the beautiful honor shame moments in the New Testament is the woman who was bleeding, who, fights her way through a crowd to get to Jesus. And it's, when you think about it, like she was ceremonially polluting every single person she came into contact with on her. So it wasn't just that she was bold. She was like risking, somebody could have just knocked her down or something, like, how dare you, that she is pushing her way through a crowd to get to him in this boldness. And then you have this reversal of cleanliness, and a lot of Muslim cultures is still a really strong value, and it's closely related to the sense of like where your shame and stuff is. And then this reversal happens where when she touches Jesus, instead of him becoming unclean, she is made clean by the interaction. And I think that's one of the things we kind of to learn to try to proclaim, especially to young people in Europe today, I think is relevant, is like God can touch you in the deepest parts of your, because I think one of the, it's super hard to be told you can be anything you want to be, like, and then if you don't measure up, and I guess if you're a young Swedish person, I guess it was like, and you can't figure out your own life, like how pathetic is that in a sense, because you've had every natural advantage, like your system, in quotes, your system is perfect,
right?
And
most Swedes secretly believe that.
Yeah.
That's
but and so
like what
if you can't figure it out, like you have nothing. There's aspiration in countries that still feel like they're kind of messed up and trying to figure it out and get past their past and everything. But when you're told, because I see that in wealthy communities in like California, like where I used to live and stuff, like it's a huge burden to have on yourself as a young person that you are supposed to now figure out how to make a name for yourself, basically.
Yeah.
And then tons of people get stuck, and so you end up with
Well, it's interesting because it's funny you talk about America being a, guilt versus innocence culture, but yet so much of what drove founding fathers was making a name for themselves. It was still shame and honor, right? Because their writings are full of it. Like Abraham Lincoln was bummed as a young man because all of the truly great things that could be done to make a name for oneself had been done in the country. Now it was just
wow.
And he had this desire. It was an Enlightenment honor, right? So it wasn't traditional, Eastern honor, but it was still honor. And so we see those things at play.
Yeah.
We were still until recently settling a lot of disputes with duels, if you think about it. Which sounds more of it because it was where you the whole, well, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, ma'am, of you besmirching my honor or besmirching the honor of my, but it was a way of dealing with that, even probably in the Old West, where you had a lot of violence, America's.
And there's a fascinating, research that's been done on because everybody culturally people were aghast at dueling for a very, very long time. And there's all this pressure that was put on in various ways to try and kill dueling. And it often came from the church or it came from women or it came from, more civilized institutions. And the great irony is that supposedly dueling only died when it became popular amongst the lower classes. So it lost its sheen, like it lost its honorableness when the riffraff started doing it, and then the upper classes finally put it aside. Wow. Which is that's a fantastic window into saying the honor thing was always there. It was just kind of buried. Or it was something you don't look at. And all this stuff is tricky. And one of the difficulties with something like Honor Restored, I can say, we were thinking about international students when we wrote it. We were thinking about how to make it. So we used the reader's version of the NIV, and knowing it was going to be translated. I really appreciated working with people all of us were thinking the whole time, how will this sound in target languages? But it is like some of the feedback we get, which I understand is it's kind of on the nose. It uses the terms honor and shame a lot. And I remember coming across a quote one time, like, one of the reasons it's really tricky about this topic is that it's shameful to talk about shame. Yeah. So and a tip for anybody who uses it or whatever it may be is to actually kind of be aware you're kind of like handling dynamite. If you open this conversation with people and to try and be really careful about it.
Wow.
So let's get back a little bit to the network for theology and culture. Theology and culture for mission. Because I think that's something we've talked to you a little bit before. We had a little quick discursus, and this idea also of where do you see that going? Where are you hoping? Where's your heart in the next couple of years of seeing how that can impact Europe?
Thank you. It's been tumultuous because the invasion of Ukraine just has for all of our colleagues and stuff been just so devastating. And so there's that, and then there's also this new. I mean, that's kind of inside baseball stuff, but this new organizational structure for us is a big challenge in terms of figuring out what it's really going to look like. So what is a network? So this is supposed to be a network inside of now Agape Europe. But what I really want to see happen is I want to know who loves this stuff in all of our countries and who is involved. There is one of the big things that was hard to resolve between our two, we had this 20 countries in sort of Eastern Central Europe and 25 or more countries in sort of a Western European area. And now we're all together, which I think needed to happen a long time ago. But the challenge is that the Eastern side had a formalized curriculum of courses for new staff, like American Campus Crusade crew staff have, and so 10 or 11 or 12 courses you took hopefully over the first 5 years you're on staff, and so that team is still working to provide those courses to the countries that want them. So I've talked to people from Agape who have said that there were various countries have their own system, and there had been conversations in the past about trying to advance that. But Agape was more decentralized, and the world we're moving into is more decentralized. So it's about providing possibilities for people, not orders. So, how do we build it out so that people know what's going on? I think it's kind of just been always one of the things for me that has just been unbelievable sometimes, is how hard it is to find out just what your own colleagues in our organization are doing, like what resources are there. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking to be able to find, 1, 2, 3 people in each country who just like this kind of stuff, And so I think what you guys are doing was a fantastic pioneering thing in that move, is in that direction, is just, hey, I actually have colleagues who like to sit around and talk about these kinds of things and are inviting other people in. And so what you guys are doing is fantastic. And I'd say that's a linchpin of this network is what you're doing. Plus we have the IBTS team, so they have a number of courses that they can offer. But longer term, what I really hope to see is gatherings and even conferences, I think, where we would pull people together and really give our staff a chance to present what they've learned, what they figured out, what they're struggling with, and even failure. Like, failure is a very, very good teacher. So for us to be hearing more from each other. And Europe is really complex because the number of different languages and identities people have, and there is an identifiable sort of Europeanness that people share. But there's also still national and even subnational differences. I love these demographic maps that don't just, the European Union does so much interesting research, right? So there's not just national maps, but like subnational maps about many, I don't know, whatever, how many people are overweight, how many people are married by a certain age, how many kids people have, like all this kind of stuff. And when you see it on the subnational levels in Europe, you realize, wow, this is fascinating how different things are. You can always still see Eastern Germany, the former East Germany, on every demographic map, right? It just pops up because it's in such a different state than the rest of Germany is. And so, I'd love to see us become more an organization that loves and platforms that. And of course, anybody who says, I have it all figured out, things are going great guns in our context and people are coming to Christ like crazy, sure, just go for it, man. Like, I don't want to slow you down, but I think that, in more and more places, we've got a lot of people. I love the illustration or the idea of like, sometimes people are out of bullets, and sometimes, you can give them a few more bullets to try and shoot. That's a violent image, but sometimes, but people need to, they need more things to take a whack with, and people leave the field, they stop being missionaries, right? Because they can't conceive of anything more than, say, using the 4 spiritual laws. If no one listens to him, that's it. That's it. And I think that's kind of a tragedy.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, Barrett and I talk a lot about, and then I think has been something of a passion of mine myself is trying to get, you talk about missional thinking practitioners, or a friend of mine, Jason Clark, who said, reflective practitioners, but the ability to build a grid about what's really happening and understand what's really happening, and understanding it's not the simple, kind of pat answers we sometimes give ourselves in crew or in American evangelicalism, but there's a lot more going on, and we really need to help people think through those things so that they do stay, so they do understand what's, it's because I feel like we intentionally or not, we often guilt ourselves, right? And it's that, well, we didn't do it right, or I'm not doing it the right way, or I'm not the person for this. And so a lot of people do leave. I mean, I remember having a conversation with a guy who had been on stint, great guy, fantastic, person, fantastic believer. And he had come back to visit Granada. And for him, he had been in Spain for 1 year as a stinter. And in his mind, they'd come, it was great. They loved Spain, but they did nothing. And there was, and because of that in their mind, they did nothing, so nothing is happening in Europe, right?
Mm.
And nothing has been happening. And I remember I was standing there with a younger staff who had come out of that same ministry that he had pioneered, right? It was many, many years on, but this is a guy who's on staff who became a Christian in the ministry, who's leading other people to Christ. Not huge numbers, but
sure,
stuff's happening. But it's worthwhile to him, and it's worthwhile to those people. And I remember we were talking to him. We said, hey, we said thanks for coming here and struggling and being here a year.
Yeah,
because it set the groundwork for this and this and this. And I remember he just started crying because he had this sense of like his entire that year of his life. Well, he loved Spain and had a great, met his wife. Good things happened, but he just felt like we were just here doing nothing, and we spinning our wheels.
Wow.
And I feel there's so many people, even who maybe even spend 4 or 5 years or longer, because they aren't able to see the whole. The three of us, we've been around a bit. We've been able to see the bigger spectrum and the bigger process that's happening here. And probably someday we'll get to look back at the hundreds of years of what happened, and wow, God really did amazing things. But so I really want to encourage like people to have the perspective, but also the ability to think through what's going on. So because there is hope, and not just to go, wow, this is pointless. Let's just go home. Kind of thing. And I think that's a big need in Western.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's one of the people that's also really helped me stay sane or whatever is been reading Leslie Newbegin, and he has this great meditation in one of his in his books where he really talks a lot about 1 Corinthians 15 and says that Paul's whole exploration of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 a lot of ways comes back to the idea of saying that because of the resurrection, your faith and your work is not in vain. And he basically ends it by more or less saying that there's an analogy between the way that Jesus had to die and then wait to see his work and his life resurrected, and Paul's awareness of his own ministry. So always, he ends by saying so always be faithful, or always be persistent, because that your labor is not in vain. And there's a beautiful song that actually came out. There's a really neat worship project. I think it's somehow associated with Redeemer in New York City called actually, the name's escaping me right now. But if you look like your labor is not in vain, it's a really beautiful song, and I think that's also part of the missiological preparation. We need to not just the triumphal stuff, but the Jesus language around unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it cannot bear fruit, and that whole thing that you're going to experience a kind of death in the missions field, but because our faith is all about resurrection after death, that's, we're supposed to be able to be in that, mindset of saying the things that that's a beautiful story, Garrick, I mean, it's sad in a sense. It took a long time for him to reconnect with that, but that's a huge milestone to kind of years later kind of get reconnected and realize it wasn't in vain.
Yeah. I think that's it highlights also the importance of us as people who are in a place long term. So whether it be Americans or Croatians in the place, but to say, hey, you're entering at a point in history, but history did not start with you, and it will not end with you.
Yep.
You're here for a little while, and God bless it. There were two pictures that we always use in Sweden. In a lot of older cultures, you can go walking and there's always stone walls, and you wonder, who put that stone wall there and why did they do it? And the whole reason that they did it was because there were stones in the fields, and they needed to get crops out of those fields. So they made stone walls because it was what the materials that they had. And we as Americans go, oh, wow, isn't that great, stone wall? And it's like, yeah, you don't understand. That stone wall was a lot of effort. And generations built those stone walls over a long time in order to get the fruit out of the ground at a later point. And so we would always tell people in Sweden, where are you entering in? You may be pulling stones your entire year. Don't think that that's not worth it. It is worth it, but it's kind of the lot that you've been given.
It's
for
a beautiful picture.
It's not a lot, but it is your lot in life. And the other thing I would say is, Michael Medital and I once tricked N.T. Wright into having lunch with us.
No way.
He kind of so Michael was trying to get N.T. Wright to sponsor him in a PhD program. And NT Wright said, well, hey, I'm not taking anyone new. I'm cutting my hours, blah, blah, blah. He said, but hey, listen, if you're ever in St. Andrews, look me up. I'd love to have a further conversation about this. So Michael calls me and says, hey, you want to go to St. Andrews? And I said, why? He said, meet with NT Wright. And I said, sounds like a plan. So then he emails NT Wright a couple of weeks later. He says, hey, matter of fact, I'll be in England. Would you like to meet up for lunch? So we go and have lunch with NT Wright. And we were asking him about kind of, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And so here is one of the world's foremost theologians, brilliant mind. And I got a little ticked because he said, well, I'll quote Leslie Newbegin. And I was like, well, come on, man. I'm buying your lunch here. I want some original thoughts. And he says, and he quotes Leslie Newbegin, and he says, I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus is risen from the dead.
Yeah.
But to me, that's why I kind of go, look, gospel presentation needs to be about eschatology. It's that Jesus is risen from the dead and he's coming back. It's that hope that carries us through. And somehow I do think that, well, let me just say, I think we need to constantly keep that in front of us in all of our conversations, whether it be evangelistic conversations or whether it be theological and missiological conversations. That hope that Jesus rose from the dead, he will return, carries us through for all of the difficulties and all of our faults and all of the shame and everything else that we have. That's the piece that we constantly forget. I forget it every day, but I do think it's really important.
And I hope that's the great, how to put this, the great strength of our organization is its dedication to let's get out there and try.
Yep.
And I think we lose ourselves if we lose that. But I noticed what the fatigue, exhaustion, or whatever that sets in for a lot of people is the feeling like you're asking me to go out there and grind on stuff that I have lost hope in. Yeah. Right. Like doing 1 year our staff team decided we're just going to go all out and, first present the God. This is like 15 years ago, present the 4 spiritual laws on every single first appointment, go for it, whatever. And see what happens. It was like, they were able to track that year, 400 gospel conversations and 0 people coming to Christ. Yeah. And they were like, well, we did it. And so I don't want to encourage anybody to just grind against kick against the goads, all the time. But our creativity, I think, is a huge strength that the body of Christ really needs. There was an article released of an interview with the Pope a few weeks ago, and it had a couple juicy statements in it about his take on the German bishops, if you're following all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But one of the people asked him about evangelism, and he just basically straight up said, I don't know how to share the, gospel in Europe right now. Mm-hmm. And I think that creates actually a huge opening for us. I can tell that the part of what I'm trying to push into myself these days is getting to know a lot more of these pretty high level, big Catholic charismatic renewal movement leaders in Croatia. I know a lot of them, and there's a priest that has an organization for they call it street evangelization. The best I can tell, most of what they do is they do parades and they go out on the street. So they're kind of out in public with large numbers, and it draws crowds. But the whole idea of training people was a similar, moment for Americans in the 1960s with Bill Bright. Is people did not know how to share their faith. And so the four spiritual laws was a radical document at the time. It's interesting how people, it had a contextualization, bold move in it with that in starting the gospel presentation that said God loves you instead of saying you're going to hell. Okay. Right. That was this bold move thing that he did. And we're, and so we're still here. And so, Barrett, if you, can dream up a way of talking about eschatological hope or whatever for Europeans. And I think we should be trying a lot of stuff. And that's the sort of good side of having some, the American roots to the organization and being sort of more pragmatic and everything. Right. But that's the way innovation happens in the world today. It's just IT companies, they don't know what's going to work. They just do a heck of a lot of A/B testing and chucking stuff out there. And then they go, oh, wow, who knew that was the color people were going to like. And I don't want us to see us become totally data driven or something like that. But I just think that it is a time of, we should feel very free to experiment and to try new things. And that's why you guys have been encouraging to me is like, when I listen to your podcast, you're open, to that, and you haven't gotten fired. So
we haven't received any pink slips yet, but they may not know where we live.
my whole staff career has been going to the forgotten places of the earth in order I literally live 40 miles from a place called the end of the earth. so it's I don't know, been my strategy, and
they can't fire you if they can't find you. So Nolan, if someone's looking to get involved in this network, how can they get connected? How can they start?
So the network itself right now exists on this internal platform we have for people in Agape called Workplace. So if you look on Workplace and you look for this thing called Theology in Culture for Mission, would love for you to just hit the join, like, follow, whatever button it is on that platform, and start posting. Just start writing stuff or replying to other people, things like that. I mean, we have kind of it's a little bit slower, moved a little bit slower than I hoped it would with, again, the things I was mentioning before. Yeah. But that's just to get to know people, or send me an email, nolan.sharp@crew.org, and say, hey, I'm here. This stuff interests me. And like I think that that's kind of like there's the one side, which might be I don't know if that's the supply side or kind of like trying to figure this out, but I think there's the demand side too, which is that like Barrett bringing up NT Wright. I mean, we have smart students in a lot of places that are reading NT Wright and are saying like, I love this. And I'm not sure how much a lot of our staff feel comfortable entering into some of those discussions without, again, maybe you guys in Agape didn't have as much of that, but in Eastern Europe, there's a little bit more of a kind of a gatekeeper mentality sometimes of like, let's just not bring that into the conversation because it'll take away from our focus or whatever. But I think it's pretty hard to do with people, especially. I think that's another thing that's happened in the culture of missions and the culture of Christian organizations is we didn't see the deeper level of the shocks of culture shifts that happened in the internet, basically, because it used to be possible to just you knew the world of your denomination or of your organization and not a whole lot else. But now it's like a couple clicks on the internet and you've fallen into some totally different side of the world, and it's challenging. Like there's no way we as missionaries can keep up with everything that's out there. But I bet there's somebody amongst 2,000 missionaries with Agape in Europe. There's probably somebody who has actually thought about it. So just that we would know each other better. Yeah. But yeah, either that Workplace group or email works real well.
Yeah. Well, we probably need to wrap up, but I do think it's important before we go to mention
obscure music reference coming right now.
No.
Oh, darn it.
But just to mention, another gift Coratia has given to the world is the beautiful game. Some great soccer players.
Yeah,
and I think your son plays soccer.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean football. We understand. And to all you Brits out there who are like, it's called football. Actually, soccer.
Exactly.
Association football. It's a British term that was used up until
routinely
yes. Up until the 80s, and when Americans started playing it and started calling it soccer, the Brits said, we can't call it that anymore. Let's call it football. So just if you are out there, it's called soccer, and it's okay to say soccer.
It's okay to say soccer. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'd love to talk about that. Like you had mentioned on the email, and I was thinking about last night when I was on a walk a little bit of like God gave me, I think, as a dad, like a huge gift through that, and watching Dana, my older son, play soccer, football, and my younger son Philip was doing piano training for 7 or 8 years. But the whole way that activities are handled in Europe, you guys, I'm sure that could be a whole nother podcast, is raising your kids in those kind of environments. But the way that you typically choose like one activity, it's not in school. You join a full-blown professional organization, basically from a very young age. So I played recreational soccer badly for 10 years as a kid growing up. And I remember I was like when I saw my son's team, like, and boys they'd be scoring goals off of headers in like second grade and stuff, and I was like, I don't remember seeing that till we were like close to high school or something.
And there was one dude who could do it, right?
There was the one kid whose like dad was Hungarian or something. Yeah. So
it was a Dutch exchange student who was actually terrible in the Netherlands, but he
was a star in America. So that was been a huge gift. I mean, Daniel just played all 12 years in the local club that's almost across the street from us, but they fought their way into a top ranked league, and he had various amounts of success and injuries and discouragements and stuff. But we're very glad for him. He's gonna go to a small Christian college, but he's gonna play on the team there, and I'm really, really glad for him in that. And I was thinking last night, that's also an interesting cultural moment, is that, so Croatia came in second in the World Cup in 2018.
I was actually in Croatia during the game. It was a blast. Even the loss, people celebrated. People were out in the streets, and it was amazing.
And there are a couple of things about that were really interesting. One, I'm gonna try and be brief. One is that was the last gasp of the last generation. So the older guys on that team, especially like Mario Mandzukic and Luka Modric and a couple of other guys, were the last generation who had been themselves formed by memories they had of the war. Mm-hmm. So they had been very small boys when the war happened and had refugees. So this is where I'm going to get in trouble. Somebody will write you a note or something. But as far as I remember, like Mandzukic and Modric and at least one of the other guys had been refugees themselves as kids. Mm-hmm. And so they had these powerful memories and experiences of that. And the cohesion that they had, like as a team, they had all sorts of disappointments in major, like in the Euros and in the World Cups, and like the 10 or 12 years leading up to that. It was like kind of just considered this like complete meltdown. And they finally had this coach that somebody pulled out of nowhere. Like everybody, when they announced the national coach, Dalic, everybody was like, who? Like no one ever heard of the guy. But he seemed to have he wasn't trying to push them around a lot. He kind of he worked more on the spirit of the team and let them play, and everything just like came together for them. And they were constantly singing songs in the locker room together, and just it was just one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, that when they came back, they were supposed to have a reception for them in the main square in Zagreb. And it was announced to be at such and such a time or whatever. It was just incredibly hot day in August and, or late July or whatever. And, it took them like 6 or 7 hours to get from the airport to the square because people lined the whole route. Wow. And over 400,000 people came out to see them. Like that's 10% of the population of the country. Yeah. Like it's just you can't even put that in a category in the United States, right? You could never get 30 million people, Americans, to squish in somewhere. But that level of energy and appreciation for the team that came in second was just it was stunning and it was interesting. Like after that, I had you couldn't find any Croatian jersey stuff anywhere. It was a huge missed opportunity for Nike that they did not print a whole lot of stuff. So I had some bootleg jersey and I wore it to a Global Leadership Summit event in Chicago. That's somewhere there were literally people from all over the world. And it was remarkable how many people came up to me from small countries and said, we were cheering for you guys. And they knew every player's name. They knew so much about them because I don't know, besides Croatia, when's the last time a country that's not France, Italy, Germany, Brazil, Spain, whatever, got into the finals of the World Cup? So it meant so much to smaller countries that maybe if they can do it, maybe we can too. So it was
because Croatia for population size punched way above
the weight.
Right.
And to be fair though, Croatia, so 98, the team, the Davor Suker, Krasnecki were third. Incredible team, so there's something going on, and now it's blessing America because of course the greatest American player right now, is Croatian American and is fantastic.
There was a combination of things in Yugoslavia. A statistic or a story that I just kind of tickles me somehow, or I find really interesting, is that in high school. I mean, you were old enough to remember. So Toni Kukoc he was a soccer player until he was 14 and he got too tall. And there's a whole thing actually supposedly where being a good soccer player is actually good prep for becoming a good basketball player because there's so much footwork involved that, to be a really good basketball player, a lot of it is about footwork, and soccer players have all that down. But Kukoc was a soccer player until he turned 14 and got super tall, and they basically told him this is going to work out for you. But he grew up either in the same building or the next entrance to Slaven Bilic, who was one of the great guys of that 98 generation. Yeah. And there's this crazy density of like young, guys born in the 60s, late 60s, who went on to become superstar soccer players that were like involved with just a couple of clubs in Split. And there was a thing in Yugoslavia where, because it was a socialist country, so they had a lot of central funding for sports and stuff like that, but it wasn't a closed country, so these guys could go around and get training and get contact with players from all over the place. Croats are tall. I mean, there's several different things that go in there, but it's really amazing how, and still to this day, like a large number of the European basketball players that end up in the NBA have Serbian, Slovenian, Croatian, whatever
Luka
roots.
Doncic in Dallas.
Yeah.
Dallas Mavericks, incredible player.
Yeah.
He's Serbian, but from Slovenia, I believe.
So it is, and it was funny for me to watch, as I was never any good at sports. My son go through this system and realize like how, how to put this. There's just it doesn't work out for everybody. So it's you have to be able to put up with what in America would seem like super old school harshness, basically, of just like, you did it wrong, do it again, kind of stuff. It's a low affirmation environment, and for my younger son, he didn't like it. So, but my older son, just kind of, it all fit for him, and he thrived in it. And he's like, the thing that everybody talks about in America now, like resiliency and grit and all this kind of stuff. Well, it's probably if your kids in Spain or whatever, it's like, that is not really that questionable for the experience of growing up in Croatia, because there's no coddling kind of and I see the bad side of it too. I see the negative side of it.
Yeah, it can be toxic sometimes. We've seen a little bit of that with our daughter in dance. Professional dance conservatory. There's some good stuff. Great, similar experience, but also some. Yeah,
really, so that's the part I actually miss from America. I miss the. But I think that's disappearing in the United States as well. But the older, like, American idea of, you just show up at school and you're not that stressed out about it, and you play 2 different sports, and you're in band, and you're in debate club, and you're in you just do all these happy things, and you go to a decent college, but you're a well-rounded person. So I think America, that traditional strength of America would be in preparing kind of well-rounded people in that middle class sort of ideal.
From an outsider's perspective, who's been gone for 22 years now, I think those days are gone.
I think they are. I mean, they're going in the sense of that, because I have a nephew basically nephews who basically experienced that, but in a small town in Minnesota.
Yeah. So of course there's pockets, and look, America is never short of a you're awesome, and one of our Dutch staff one time told me, Americans are great. If you try 10 things and one succeeded, you think you're the most amazing, team that's ever existed. In the Netherlands, when we try 10 things, we look at 9 failures, and it's like, okay, there's a difference. So we grew up with maybe a different perspective on ourselves. Well, listen, Nolan, a huge, incredible pleasure to talk to you, my friend.
Yeah, this was fun.
We need to do this again. We'll get deep into the weeds on some minute theological issue about
let's do it.
Croatian Catholic theology. And but no, seriously, let's do it again. Listen, if you want to get in touch with Nolan, staff or not staff, if you think these things are interesting, you want to be a part of it, email him at nolan.sharp@cru.org, or if you are on staff and happen to be on Workplace, seriously, do check out the theological and what I'm sorry, again, I'm a member.
Theology and Culture for Mission. There you go.
Theology and Culture for Mission, great group. And you will be blessed by it, interact with it, and add to the conversation. As always, guys, hey, actually, Nolan, we're looking forward to getting you here to Spain so we can walk the Camino together. So let's that was another thread that we're talking about. We're gonna make it happen. But until then, guys, have a great afternoon, great evening, and buen Camino.